So my name is Tyler Damon. I'm the head of Salesforce DevOps and QA at S&P Global, because we have a lot of different DevOps and QAs at S&P Global. But for the Salesforce team, this is my third year at Mile High Dreaming. I was here when it was at the smaller venue with the mezzanine, and then I was here last year, and this is the first time I was speaking. So I'm excited to be here speaking and excited to be here in the main room. I'm coming from an interesting mix of technical and business background. I'm doing my MBA at CU Denver, so this will be a mix of kind of technical and business strategy when you're leveling up those DevOps and QA teams. So who is this talk for? This talk is really for people like me back at the beginning of my Salesforce journey. And my Salesforce journey was really an accidental dev. I was a web developer who joined a startup as one of the first employees, and during that I got introduced to Salesforce and into this role. You know, when you start building JavaScript web apps and then you integrate them to Salesforce as a custom CPQ solution, people realize you can develop on Salesforce and you'll get sucked into the Salesforce ecosystem. So you got to be careful. This is also going to be a fairly high-level talk. I'm not going to go terribly in depth into a lot of these concepts, but AI is our friend. So I highly encourage you, if you see a concept you're interested in diving more deeply into, to go ahead and look that and ask your favorite AI assistant. So like many startups, that one didn't make me rich. And I was recruited into S&P Global as a Salesforce developer and grew there. And there were many things looking back at my time leading a small team at the startup and then evolving at S&P that I wish I'd had a guide to consider and know what to be thinking about much earlier. And so this is that guide to me 5 years ago. So some very basic terms. We're going to start extremely basic and kind of move up into where S&P sits today. So what is DevOps, right? So as it suggests, it's the practice of combining your software development with IT operations, right? Getting your metadata from the lowest points up into prod, preferably with fast delivery time and high quality releases. And then what is QA? Quality assurance. That's just making sure your software is working as expected and meeting the business specified requirements. It can be done manually and it can be done automatically. There was a great talk yesterday where they were talking about different tools. Hopefully that one's on YouTube too in the future and something to look into. So my theme here is leveling up, right? One of the great things about a presentation like this is you get to spend a few hours of your workday playing with ChatGPT and generating images. So this is my little level 1 adventurer, just starting to learn DevOps magic. Got a levitating computer and a little familiar. So I can't draw, but ChatGPT can. So I do have a confession. One of the reasons this talk is about leveling up is I have lost months of my life to World of Warcraft and Star Wars. So level 1 through 20, the solo, possibly accidental admin, right? Your company just bought Salesforce. This was my case with a startup. We started with other CRMs and then eventually moved to Salesforce, thankfully, because those other CRMs weren't that good. So now what, right? What kind of DevOps is possible when it's just you, right? Can you QA yourself? I certainly was here, and some basic DevOps can really help prevent and mitigate emergencies. You know what you really don't want to happen in a hot tub in Breckenridge? There could be a lot of bad answers to that question, but one of them is your chief sales officer calling you on Saturday saying, hey, you broke prod. Where you can avoid that. If you can put in some basic protections, that's a good way to do things. So as a solo admin, you're definitely going to be spread very thin. Solo admin / developer, right? One of the things you can do as that solo admin is just establish some policies, right? It might sound kind of weird to just be giving policies to yourself, but for me personally, I found that useful, right? I said, like, hey, I need to test this before I deploy it to prod after a couple deployments to prod, right? So, you go code the thing and then try to manually test it yourself. Another thing to look into is establishing some kind of version control, right? Git is a great tool. It's a very powerful open source tool. A lot of ways you can potentially implement that. It does have a downside that it wasn't built for SaaS systems, and that means there's some weirdness. Coming from a JavaScript developer background, it was a very interesting shift because from JavaScript, you've got your Git source and you literally build out a source. So you know that what is in Git is your web app. That's not always true in Salesforce, right? It's more of a reflection in some cases of what is in your prod, and sometimes there can be a drift there. And that is a challenge that is something to kind of consider. So, but having it in Git, having what you wrote in Git in case something gets overwritten can still be very valuable. I have been in the situation where we're committing to Git And it's just a commit. It's literally just a commit from VS Code to Git, and then a totally separate deployment into prod, but it was still useful to have that source of truth, knowing what our version was in Git. Another idea, right, even if you're a solo admin, is get some kind of backup. You know, this could be as simple as just pulling a dev sandbox before a major release from your prod org. Doing something, just getting started, is an idea. And again, these are things I didn't do with startup. And I swear it's not my fault the startup failed. It was other things. They liked Salesforce. And again, as I mentioned earlier, do try to test things a little bit before you release them. So I got to play more with ChatGPT, and now you're level 20, right? You're leveling up in the game, and you're exploring the world. Your familiar has gotten bigger. You've got a little bit of a more advanced magical powers. So hopefully at this point, you've got a few team members. Hopefully you've been joined by maybe a handful of devs, a handful of admins. You're still probably wearing many hats, right? Each of these team members probably isn't specialized into DevOps yet. Everyone's doing some coding, some flows. However, now that you have multiple people on the team, peer reviews and sign-offs become possible. A formal peer review process where at least someone else is looking at your code and saying, hey, that looks good. Hey, I don't think that's going to break prod. And someone else who maybe functionally tests it. Again, this is a very much an agile concept, right? That everyone on the team can do every hat. And I found that really easy to implement in a startup and in a small team. It gets a little harder as you get bigger. But this is just something to definitely be working on in your small team. You know, maybe I developed this story, you know, employee 1 is QAing it, employee 2 PRs it, and we just rotate. We rotate as we're developing those stories. And your features are certainly going to be growing in size and complexity. And sign-offs. So also at this point, a sign-off can be separate from peer review. The sign-off might be, maybe someone is wearing more of an architect hat and saying, hey, I signed this off, it's good to go to prod. This is a really nice size because you know everyone really well, right? It's a small team, you're probably very close, great interpersonal relationships. At this point, you might be thinking about some kind of front-end test automation. Certainly, you have to write your Apex back-end tests. Start thinking about open-source front-end automations like Selenium. There's a robotic testing framework. You don't even necessarily have to pay for these. Some of these are open source. And then certainly, you also have partners who will provide you with all kinds of fancy other things. And again, your devs might be writing their own tests. That's fine. Make the dev write their own test or have another dev test that dev. I think at this point, you can start leveraging that advantage of having multiple team members. I'm getting to this a little early, but consider adopting more advanced release strategies as you're developing in your size and complexity of features. And also keep in mind, not every strategy fits every product and project. We do not use all these strategies for the same type of project, even at S&P. So the first thing is try to be agile. This is great, right? You have small user stories, you're getting them into prod, you're getting that user feedback. Every 2 weeks, you're refining. That's wonderful. Agile is great. Unfortunately, some projects require larger cutovers. For example, CPQ. So then you need advanced release strategies. One of the first advanced release strategies that I've done completely separate talks on is dark deployments. So if you can, start thinking about separating your release from the go live. So you want to actually get as much of your code into production before you turn it on for the users as possible. There's a lot of different strategies to that. Again, I've done 30-minute talks on this. Things like permission sets, you know, controlling the access to potentially a very large chunk of code. We have done this before with a new quote system. It was all hidden behind a new record quote type, and it was an extremely successful release because we could actually roll it out very gradually, which brings up maybe the second point. This is another one to ask AI about, is look into how Google enables gradual rollouts on Android. They roll out their releases to just 1% of their users at once, and then 10%, and then eventually 100%. And that's wonderful, because then you don't have a million P1 bugs coming at a time, right? You get that 1% of P1 bugs coming in, you resolve those, and you gradually roll out. Again, one of our most successful shifts of quoting types we did this for. We were able to do that very gradual rollout process to small subsets of users, fix the errors as they encountered them. But again, unfortunately, this isn't always possible, right? If you're changing your finance backend entirely, that does usually have to be a hard cutover. And so we do this where we can, but we also understand sometimes you're going to have a rough release weekend. All right, Now we're getting to level 40 through 60. You're getting more and more powerful. Maybe your familiar is out there adventuring in the world. You're getting all kinds of cool new magic spells. You'd be surprised how hard it is to get ChatGPT to generate like a DevOps sandbox thing. I was like, give me magical sandbox architecture layouts, and it didn't want to give me that. So now you might have 2 or 3 teams working on Salesforce, right? Now you can really be thinking about your formal QA and UAT processes. When you have teams of this size, you may have people who are dedicated full-time QAs, right? You might have UAT from the business, right? The business side has designated users who are giving you UAT processes. And the really sad thing that's going to be a headache is it may be mandated by regulations. The regulations may also start requiring more specialized roles like release engineers. Anyone here who may or may not be SOX compliant, we are SOX compliant. That involves a whole other set of rules, but we have begun separating those roles and responsibilities in ways that makes that audit much easier for us, right? When the developer is very clearly separated from the release engineers, there's a clear handoff, it makes our SOX audits go much more smoothly because separation of duties is one of their big principles. Now, one thing when you're starting to get into this, start thinking about templates and shared documents. So we do have standardized QA templates. Somya, one of my QA leads, is here. She has a wonderful template that she shares with her team, and they use it consistently. It's very clear when you're looking at your ADO user story that that is your QA sign-off. It says QA approved. That just makes everyone's life easier, especially as your architects are doing reviews, because you are probably doing now formal release requests. We actually have a formal release request in ADO saying these are the stories we want to release. We check them all for QA and UAT sign-off, and then we make sure that an architect has also signed off, actually 2 sign-offs, before any kind of release. Again, a lot of that is SOX mandated, but it also helps us keep things really clean and make sure there's lots of sets of eyes, making sure we're not going to release something into production that's going to be a headache. The other thing we like to do is we have a 1-pager of best practices, and I actually have 2 of these. I have one for QA and I have one for DevOps. And this is kind of like our core rules of things not to do, like don't make changes in production, right? Don't do any kind of crazy commits, right? Don't commit in the UAT environment and then try to go to production. You know, you might pick up junk in UAT. So that is another thing I suggest, and I suggest 1 page. I've seen 300-page documents. People aren't reading those, right? It's much easier to take 2 minutes and read a 1-pager than half your day and read a 300-page Bible on what are your QA documents. So I highly recommend an accessible level of your core rules. And the other advantage then is when someone violates it, you say, hey man, this is just a 1-page. Let's make sure we've read that. Another thing is you're starting to get into all this change management, right? You're going to start wanting to really talk to your teams and communicate to your teams as you're making significant changes, right? If your Git repo might be going into the source format, if you're implementing new automation quality gates, you probably need to start giving your teams a much bigger heads up. We do all team calls, right? We'll get together with the entire value stream, multiple teams, and say, hey, here's what's coming next. Be aware of this. You're going to need to start doing this kind of test before you do deployments. And you also want to make sure the business is aware of that, right? If the business is saying, hey, why can't we just release this immediately? You want to make sure you're saying, hey, we do automated layout tests because layouts keep mismerging, and we don't want to cause a P1 when we release your new field. You're also probably getting into some multi-project complexity, right? You're getting multi-teams working together, and that can lead to a lot of conflicts and overwrites on shared metadata, right? This is really tricky. We have wrestled with this for years, and we still wrestle with it. You want to brainstorm strategies with your team to talk about how are we going to prevent stepping on each other's toes. One of the things you might do is you have someone who's kind of focused on sales, someone who's focused more on service, someone who might be focused more on document generation. You can kind of assign teams objects like that, and that'll help reduce some of it, but you're still probably going to be stepping on each other's toes a little bit. Another question you might ask is, do you want to use unlocked packages and package development models? They might work for certain use cases, right? If you're extending a package, if you're writing some kind of custom package, certainly the unlocked package model is an option rather than kind of managing all your code together and keeping those sandboxes refreshed. You're also getting to the stage now that you need to be prioritizing automation on QA. You might have gotten away with manual testing up until this point, but as you're getting more and more complex and your software is just getting to a point that only your people who've been there for 5 years know it well, you're going to want to try to start working on end-to-end automations with the testing tool of your choice. And one of the ways you do that is you get your team member champions. You get a few people who have shown interest in really diving in and learning those automation tools. Give them some space, right? Maybe reduce their workload on the day-to-day manual testing user stories so they can really be learning your automation tool, putting your automation tool into practice, building regression tests, building BVT tests. All right, now we are the super master, right? You're getting into levels 80 to 100 plus. You're getting into end-game content. You've magically grown a giant beard, and you've got really powerful magical spells. So as we mentioned before, we're very multi-value stream and multi-instance. Your complexity integrations have multiplied. You're probably integrated to a ton of systems. That's going to make refreshes harder. And you have a huge number of admins, developers, and consultants all trying to work together in parallel. So this provides some opportunities and challenges. As I mentioned before, you're probably regulated by now and compliant with controls like SOX. But the advantage is you have multiple value streams. So if you've got a new tool you want to experiment with, maybe you have a slightly smaller value stream that you could implement this tool in first, see if it works, and then if it works well, roll it out to other instances. So there's pros and cons as you get this size. The other trick is keeping consistency across them in policies and procedures, right? And this is a question that you hear in business school, right? Is do you want to force everyone to use the same policy or procedure, or leave a little bit of leeway, leave a little bit of flexibility for their individual value streams? And we do strike a balance on that, right? An interesting concept is polarities, right? It's a balance, right? Do you want to force it and say, hey, everyone use this template, or everyone can use their own template? And usually somewhere in the middle of, make sure your template has these elements might be a good spot to balance. So as we're getting up there with QA automation, we start thinking about the BVT, right? Build, validate, tests, and quality gates. You have so many teams working on this metadata. Layouts in particular seem to be one that's always a headache for us because everyone's changing the layouts. They're committed at different stages. They're mismerging. That is one that, and unfortunately, it causes P1s because the business says, hey, where's my field? So one of the core ones we automated first was post-deployment checks on our layouts, right? So after we do a deployment, we go check the layout against, we actually use Smartsheet. So we have a list of the fields that are supposed to be on the layout in Smartsheet. Our automated test checks Smartsheet, says, are all the fields there? And if it's not, we get a failure back, and that tells us, hey, something's wrong with this commit. Certainly, as I mentioned, layouts are kind of my worst nightmare because they seem to be the one that has the most challenges. Then we also do overnight testing. We have had some very interesting P1s where someone made what looks like a minor mistake, but it brings the whole system down, right? So you need some kind of automated fire and forget, automated test overnight. So we do that. So we do a BVT automated overnight. That is usually in our stage environment. We do a dev to QA to UAT, and then stage just before going the next day. So that's also very nice. And then kind of your final level of QA are the full regression tests. We are so heavily integrated to external systems, it's hard for us to have a full regression test run automatically. We have to have someone go fire a few things out of other systems to do the full regression tests. So that becomes a process if someone fires off something, waits a couple hours, makes a change in another system, waits a few hours. And so we kind of think of our QA in those three levels. And that is pretty much the next slide. I got ahead of myself. All right, so LFG. So if anyone is not a video gamer, this is called looking for group, right? Certainly at this stage, you don't want to be doing this by yourself, right? You want to have a strong group with you. So at S&P, fairly recently, about 3 years ago, we built centers of excellence. So now that our Salesforce teams are 100 plus, it's time to build teams dedicated to functions, like automation, releases, and just maintaining your DevOps platforms and Git repos. These teams are also very well versed in compliance. They're one of our first stages of defense. If someone goes and tries to do a release request missing a UAT sign-off, missing an architect sign-off, our DevOps Center of Excellence says, hey, we're not releasing that until you go get that. It also reduces the number of people who can touch prod. If you've got 150 people working on Salesforce, do you want 150 people touching prod? Probably not. We only have about 10 people who can touch any particular prod and make a direct change that isn't going through version control and all those automated test gates. These DevOps teams, these center of excellences, are very closely integrated with your development teams. They're going to work together to merge conflicts, right? You have multiple dev sandboxes, they're all deploying. Sometimes there's a merge conflict. You don't want your DevOps team resolving that on their own. They're going to reach out to them and get it resolved for the developers. So your DevOps team actually needs to be very social. They're not a developer who can go, sit for 9 hours and not talk to anybody. They're going to be talking and knowing and very visible to your overall team. So strong interpersonal and communication skills are going to be very required for that team. So how do you build that center of DevOps excellence? I do not recommend finding just some random person who doesn't know anything about DevOps and assigning them to DevOps. Even when I joined and helped set up our DevOps team, I already had pretty extensive experience with Git and Git DevOps with JavaScript, and so I learned it for our Salesforce. These team members are going to be very wide, deep, and collaborative. It's kind of a different skill set from a standard Salesforce developer because you're looking at Git. I don't know if you've ever taken a layout and then gone and looked at the layout XML or a FlexiPage, looked at the FlexiPage XML, which looks like a nightmare. They're hard to merge, right? It becomes a very unique, different skill set. And then you also have to balance flexibility and rigidity. And again, this is another one of those polarities because the issue is you're going to have a business unit that comes in and says, hey, we got a P1, this is work stopping, we've got to get this fixed. Can you bypass some procedures and get it done? And there's a balance there, right? How bad is the P1? Can we bypass one or two of our advanced checks and manually check this for this? And it's a case-by-case basis. And so you're going to want to make sure your DevOps Center of Excellence has a really good judgment call on being able to do that kind of thing. Again, kind of as talked about earlier, the regulations and handoffs at this stage are very, very formalized and critical, right? We do a weekly release. I know CI/CD is very nice. We're just a little too big to really get into full CI/CD. So weekly, we hand off from the teams to DevOps. They do a formal meeting. They chat with everybody. The DevOps team cross-checks all those sign-offs from QA and UAT, checking the architect release approvals, moves it into stage. And then from stage environment, where you run some of those automated tests, make sure they're all green, and then we can go ahead and go to prod. This ensures that compliance audits go much more smoothly. This is somewhat new for us. It took us a long time to evolve to this level, and certainly that's why I talk about this being a leveling up. I mean, it has taken us years and years and years to keep leveling up, implementing these new practices, and just building that experience with the teams. Recognition for your teams. This is what I'm passionate about. I mean, I'm obviously a huge DevOps and QA nerd, but we're so foundational, right? We're the road that the successful projects run on. We're the foundation of the skyscraper, and sometimes we kind of get forgotten. And so it's very important, especially if you're leading those DevOps teams, if you're leading that QA team, you need to really kind of shout out your team's successes, make sure you're getting in newsletters, make sure you're appreciating them on your project management Slack or Teams, because they don't interface directly with the business side, because the business doesn't talk to them the way they talk to the architects or product owners. Sometimes they kind of get forgotten. When the business says, hey, great job on this project, we have to go and remind them, hey, don't forget, the people behind the curtain who are also working really hard to get this done. So you want to work with management and other teams to ensure that you have a strong culture of recognition, and it's very broad and that people aren't getting forgotten. Make sure there's a good team map that's easily accessible and remind people to actually look at it. Maintaining excellence. This is one that has come to us a little more recently, right? When you're first setting it up with your core initial team, then you're not going to have an issue. They all know what the rules are. But as time goes on, this can be a problem. So among many reasons to be sad that life is not like video games, the problem is you can go down in levels, right? People can forget things, especially someone who maybe doesn't use the DevOps commit process on a regular basis, may forget some of those best practices. So we do regular reminders. So we're on Safe Agile, and so during our PI planning, we do a regular meeting and say, hey, remember, here are some of our rules for DevOps. Here are our rules for QA. Another really important one is do retros. After you do a huge release, something you've been working on for 9 months, do a retro. And if it went smoothly, you really want to remember to do a retro because people say, hey, it went great. we're good. We don't need to worry about it. No, you need to write down why it went great, right? Lock in that knowledge. Really remind the teams why it went well, and make sure you do that again in the future, because we've had that experience, right? We've had some projects that we dark released. It was a very smooth release weekend, and then a year later, they forgot the elements that made it so smooth, and you have a rough release weekend. If you're leading a team, stay in touch with them, right? You're probably doing a one-on-one with your directs every week. Also do skip levels, right? Talk to the team, hear what their career goals are. It's very encouraging for them to be able to talk to people in management, and just get to know your team as well as you can. And then, like today, attend conferences to be aware for industry trends, right? Make sure you're aware of what's going on in the industry, what are the new tools out there, what are the new ideas. I personally have gotten some really cool ideas from conferences that I then took back and tried to implement. Tips for all levels, right? So no matter if you're a solo admin or leading a huge team, you got to be really proactive. Engage the business. Make sure they've heard words like Dart deployment and they're thinking about it when they're writing consulting contracts. Because if the consultants don't have Dart deployments written into their consulting contract, you may be in for a headache and pushback. The other thing to be proactive on is hear about what meetings are going on. I remember there was a case that I was working as an architect, and they kept talking about some consultants coming in. I was like, who are these consultants? I didn't hire them. No one on my team knows they're coming in. What's going on? And so I had to insist to get in the meeting with those consultants and start communicating these concepts to them. So you want to kind of keep your finger on the pulse in the business and be listening for whispers of some kind of new project, because sometimes the business goes and hires consultants without you knowing. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is an ode to the stage environment. Oh, stage environment, why did we resist you for so long? Configuration drift in UAT led to such painful prod deployments. Now we refresh you regularly, and back deployments run so smoothly. This was something that happened in our org. We are just so tightly integrated, refreshes are difficult. And so because refreshes are so difficult, our UAT environment sometimes sits for, one PI, two PIs. And our stage environment can get refreshed on a regular basis, monthly. So it stays much closer to production. And implementing that was one of the biggest things that helped our process improvements. I think I skipped something about refreshes. I was going to talk about refreshes. If you're refreshing sandboxes and you get to a really high level of integrations, you're going to want a checklist. We actually have one of the dedicated roles on our team is a refresh manager. They actually communicate with the teams, organize refresh meetings, make sure we've got Informatica and other integrations ready to do their refreshes and reconnections. And that has eventually brought our refresh process down from a month to more like 5 days. That is really a kind of organizational thing. And again, it's just so many integrations and getting that whole group together, warning them that a refresh is coming. It's very, very important. So that's great. That took about 30 minutes, I think. Yeah, perfect. So I wanted to have a little questions and discussions. If anyone had any, do you have any questions on implementing DevOps and QA at different sizes? And do we have any tales of woe or heroics from your organization?
How do you handle multiple program pipelines? Is there a staging environment between UAT for each of the programs and production?
So in our case, we actually have multiple value streams. We actually don't just have one Salesforce value stream. We actually have, I think we're up to 10 now, and each one of those might have multiple developer sandboxes to a QA, to a UAT, to a stage. It is still a challenge, and we've done some strange juggling in the past of where we have dev sandboxes going into those pipelines. But yeah, at a high level, we do have separate value streams controlled from a master Salesforce.
I have a mic now for other questions.
Cool, we got a mic for questions. Anyone see someone over there? I love your shirt. I heart LWC. I do too, because I was an Angular developer, and the web component framework, it's wonderful.
I totally agree. I never learned Aura, and I never plan to. Do you have any tips for solo admins who are terrified of the GitHub language, but we really would like to connect our org so that we have like a source of truth, and if we overwrite some good code with some bad code, we can go back to the good code?
That's a good question. Git was like my enemy for so long. When I was on JavaScript, it took me so long to just wrap my head around Git. It is weird. I would encourage using a tool. There are tools that will do a lot of that for you, and you almost don't have to look at Git. We personally are pretty deep with Capado. They've been good for us in our size and complexity, but there's a number of other tools out there. I think, unfortunately though, eventually you're going to have to look into Git a little bit. They'll handle like your commits. They'll make it almost look like you're not using Git. However, there usually is a point of complexity or error that you're probably going to need someone on your team who likes Git. And the other thing I'd say about that is well, if you're a solo admin, that's tricky. Once you have a couple people, you might find a Git nerd. There are definitely Git nerds out there who love Git. But yeah, I would encourage one of the tools. There are certainly tools to accelerate. Sure.
I got it.
I like jumping off stages. Video games.
So I'm a solo admin myself, and I started using DevOps Center, which is not the greatest solution out there, but it's free. And if you are a solo admin, it actually makes things easier, and it does work with GitHub and stuff. So if you haven't looked at it and you're solo, it's worth looking at. I don't want to say it's amazing, it's going to do everything perfectly, and it does create some headaches, but overall, it has made my life easier versus not using it.
Yeah, and I should mention, I talk about automation at the high levels. Automation as a solo admin is great. Where you can get automation, where you can get automated testing, I mean, use it because you're by yourself. And it's also a good sell to your leadership. Be like, hey, it's just me. Give me some money for this cool tool.
As someone who does mostly package development and gets annoyed when my build takes more than a few minutes, what on earth takes 5 days to refresh?
Well, a Salesforce, informatic integrations, right? CPQ integrations, Marketo integrations, sometimes a Zora integration. So it's just all those external integrations and getting them connected. And that's usually the UAT environment. So we can refresh a dev environment much faster. But the UAT and QA environments, getting those refreshed with the latest data, those are a headache for sure. Yeah, dev is pretty quick. No. I mean, Salesforce gets it back to us pretty quick. It's resetting up all the integrations, masking emails, making sure everything works correctly. And you know, these other external platforms have their own sandboxes, right? So you might need to refresh a sandbox on an external platform and then reconnect it. So a lot of that coordination.
You mentioned embracing a staging environment, a pre-prod environment. I think the biggest challenge that we've had with that is with integrations, because there are some systems that don't have multiple lower environments. So if you want to have like a full UAT box where like your users can go in there and like actually test the system, then you have to point that integration there instead of having it in staging. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what we do. Our UAT environment is a very close copy of prod in its integrations. One of my biggest complaints about Salesforce and their sandbox setup is how much they charge you for a full copy sandbox. I'd love to, hopefully talk to people at Dreamforce and be like, can we please, with Hyperforce, get cheaper full copy sandboxes? We don't have a full copy sandbox available for our stage. So our stage is a Dev Pro or a Dev Box. It's mostly about making sure the metadata is right and the deployment is going to go correctly there. We do some automated testing, but it's not any automated testing of the integrations. It's mostly core inside Salesforce automated testing. That more integration testing has to stay in UAT, and that's just economic realities of how expensive the sandboxes are. But yeah, I'd love cheaper full copy sandboxes, because I could use 5 full copy sandboxes. Some CPQ, right? CPQ development really wants a full copy sandbox, so more full copy sandboxes for all.
Thanks. Hey, Tyler. Obligatory AI question. What have you seen thus far coming out in terms of AI that's changed the way that DevOps works, and what are you seeing, or what are you excited about on the horizon?
Sure. So, I'm talking fantasy here, but I'm actually a huge sci-fi fan. So I'm looking forward to being a cyborg. Let's integrate with AI, right? I mean, I think, give me the plugin so I can do releases with a thought. I think it's going to be a companion, right? I don't think AI is necessarily going to replace people. We've certainly heard that theme at keynotes here yesterday. And it's not necessarily that good yet. I mean, it gives you good basic answers, but when you're getting into the higher levels of complexity, I find you definitely need a human touch in there still. What was the other thing I was going to say about AI? Oh, the other interesting thing is you look at software languages and their evolution, right? We don't program in binary or hexadecimal anymore, right? You don't even want to go into C. And now you even have flows, right, instead of LWCs. So in a way, the AI is an evolution of that, right? AI is making it so we can code new customizations faster and faster. And I'm looking forward to that kind of integration with AI. I do hope it gets better in the future. There's some interesting cases too. You know, they talked about the chess and how AI beat the chess players, but then they did a game where it was like chess players using AI against the pure AI, and at least as of a few years ago, that human-machine hybrid team was winning. They might have lost since then, since I last checked it, but I am hopeful for our AI to be our friends. Cool.
We have one?
So for your value stream environments, how do you make sure that those environments are synced up with production code base? In other words, how do you do back deployments?
I'm going to get a little specific there on our tool, because we do use Capado. And that is the other reason I love my stage environment. Because what we do is people commit right from the dev boxes. They're moving up the pipeline. They get to UAT, get UAT sign-off. They go to stage. Once they're in stage, that's when we back deploy. So Capado automates our back deployments. We have people who also monitor those and resolve errors. We generally get those back deployments done before prod deployment, right? So your dev boxes are in sync before that code's going to prod, and that prevents a lot of our overwrite issues. The other kind of challenge I'll say is we did adapt our processes to work with the system, right? We had to say, okay, like, we were guilty of back deploying after prod deployments. That'll cause a lot of overwrites, right? So we reworked the process to do it in stage before prod deployment. That resolved a lot of our issues. Cool. Thank you for coming. Nice turnout, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Woohoo!
Thank you.